Many people live in a constant state of emotional exhaustion. They wake up feeling relatively well, but just a few minutes of interaction with certain individuals can make them feel as if all their vital energy has been drained. It could be that colleague who is always wrapped up in drama and complaints, a family member who calls only to unload their problems, a partner who oscillates between the role of victim and accuser, or even someone who seems innocent but leaves, after each encounter, an inexplicable feeling of weight, confusion, or guilt. This type of experience is common. In recent years, it has become popular to label these individuals as energy vampires or toxic people. The internet is full of tips on how to protect oneself from them. Light visualizations, energy baths, physical distancing, among others. However, from the perspective of deep psychology, these solutions are merely palliative and often illusory. Carl Gustav Jung, a Swiss psychiatrist and one of the greatest names in 20th century psychology, proposed a much more complex and uncomfortable explanation for this phenomenon. He did not believe that the problem lay solely with the other person. According to Jung, what we call energy drainage originates from something that happens within us, unconsciously, silently, and automatically. This process is known as psychic contamination, a kind of unconscious fusion between our emotional field and that of another person. When this occurs, the unresolved emotional complexes of the other, such as guilt, neediness, fear, manipulation, or dependency, resonate with our own dormant complexes. In other words, we absorb what already exists, to some extent, within us. People who constantly feel drained often carry deep emotional wounds, frequently linked to parental figures from childhood. They have been trained from an early age to connect with the pain of others as a way to ensure love and acceptance. Thus, in adulthood, they unconsciously take on the roles of saviors, caregivers, mediators, always ready to help, even when the other does not want to be helped, only to have someone carry their burden. Jung observed that this type of pattern is not just behavioral, it is structural. It is directly related to what he called the inferior function, the least developed aspect of our personality, where our greatest blind spots reside. It is through this gap that emotional vampires enter. It is through it that others can manipulate us without our awareness. In this video, we will explore Carl Jung's thesis in depth. We will understand why some relationships leave us emotionally exhausted, why certain people seem to drain us mercilessly, and how we can shield ourselves definitively, not through magical techniques, but through serious and transformative psychological work. If you are tired of being everyone's emotional support, feel like you are always giving more than you receive, or if you keep attracting people who drain you, this video is for you. Modern society has fallen in love with simple labels for complex problems. We call all the people who emotionally disturb us toxic. We reduce deep relationships to popular diagnoses and apply quick solutions to symptoms that have deep roots. But from a psychological perspective, this logic not only fails, it keeps us prisoners of an illusion. Carl Jung was one of the first to observe that human beings are naturally drawn to what they have not yet understood within themselves. This includes their wounds, traumas, and contradictions. When we come into contact with someone who drains us, we often believe that this person is harming us, invading us, exploiting us. But Jung saw a much more disturbing pattern. It is we who unconsciously allow this invasion because it activates something that is already alive within us, a dormant complex that has not yet been integrated. What Jung called psychic contamination is an invisible phenomenon that occurs in any relationship where there is an unconscious fusion of emotional contents. In other words, when you are not aware of your own wounds, traumas, and complexes, you become vulnerable to absorbing those of others. And what is worse, you recognize them as your own. Suddenly, you are feeling a sadness that you don't know where it came from, a guilt that makes no sense, an anxiety that seems to have no cause. But it has a cause. It's just not visible. It's symbolic. Individuals with a history of emotional neglect, absent parents, or unstable family environments tend to develop an unconscious pattern of becoming caretakers of others. They associate love with need. Therefore, when they encounter emotionally needy, confused, or manipulative people, they immediately take on the role of support. And they do this not because they are noble or compassionate, but because their unconscious has learned that the only way to deserve affection is by offering help, even if it destroys them. These people confuse empathy with emotional fusion. They feel what the other feels, carry what the other does not want to carry, and become fertile ground for others' projections. The most tragic part? They believe they are doing good, but in fact, they are merely reliving a childhood pattern of emotional survival. Jung said that everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. This includes the people who drain our energy. They are like inverted mirrors. They show us what we have not yet been able to look at. Therefore, the real danger is not in the other. It is in our blindness to ourselves. And there is a specific point in our psyche where this contamination happens most frequently. A fragile, underdeveloped region that Jung called the inferior function. It is through this crack that manipulators enter, that energy vampires connect, and that unconscious games take hold. In the next part, we will explore this function in detail and understand why it is the weak point of your mind. If this content is making sense to you, click the subscribe button and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for your support. According to Carl Jung, every human being possesses 4 basic psychological functions: thinking, feeling, sensing, and intuition. These functions operate at different levels of consciousness, and depending on each person's psychological type, one of them develops dominantly, becoming our main tool for understanding and interacting with the world. But what many ignore is that while we develop a primary function, we relegate another to forgetfulness. This is the inferior function. The inferior function represents the most fragile, least developed, and most unconscious part of our psychological structure. It is unstable, impulsive, easily manipulable, and above all, highly vulnerable to external influence. Jung saw this function as a semi-open door between the conscious and the unconscious, a blind spot through which strange psychic contents, including those from other people, can enter unnoticed. And it is precisely there that the draining occurs. Imagine a person with a dominant thinking function, logical, rational, analytical. Their inferior function will be feeling. This means that, although they are highly efficient with ideas, this person will have extreme difficulty dealing with emotions, both their own and those of others. Now imagine that they are in a relationship with someone emotionally unstable, who oscillates between neediness, victimhood, and drama. This emotional instability penetrates directly into their inferior function, activating something they do not understand, but feel. The result? Fatigue, confusion, exhaustion. The energy that should be used for their own psychic processes is now being drained to sustain a content that is not even theirs, but that, due to internal vulnerability, has been absorbed. This mechanism is not limited to thinking types. A person with a dominant feeling function, for example, may have thinking as their inferior function. They will be easily manipulated by distorted logical arguments, by people who use reason to justify emotional abuse. They feel that something is wrong, but cannot think clearly enough to protect themselves. And once again, their energy is sucked away. The inferior function is like a gap in the armor. As long as it remains unconscious and underdeveloped, you will be an easy target for anyone who knows, even unintentionally, how to access it. Emotional vampires, narcissists, manipulative people. They don't even need to do this deliberately. The unconscious dynamic between you already ensures that energy flows from you to them. What Jung proposed was not that we shield ourselves emotionally through isolation or defensiveness, but rather that we strengthen this inferior function through awareness and deliberate effort of integration. In other words, we need to become whole. We need to illuminate the part of our psyche that weakens us the most, or we will continue to be victims of psychic contamination. But there is something even deeper in this process. Jung realized that, most of the time, we are not just victims. We are attracted to what mirrors what we still deny in ourselves. In other words, the other can only affect us so much because they are showing a part of our own shadow. And that is exactly what we will explore in the next part. Carl Jung dedicated a large part of his work to the investigation of the shadow, that hidden, rejected, and unconscious side of the psyche. He did not see the shadow as something purely negative, but as a reservoir of everything you do not admit to being. And that is precisely why it becomes so dangerous, because you believe you are not it. The more you deny its existence, the more it dominates your life, silently, disguised, projected onto others. The shadow contains your repressed traits, the anger you do not admit to feeling, the envy you prefer to mask as opinion, the manipulation you condemn in others but execute subtly, the desire for control, pride, weakness, dependency. Everything your conscious identity rejects, you throw into the basement of the soul, believing that by doing so, you will be free. But you are only blind. And it is this blindness that creates the perfect conditions for energy drainage to occur. Jung observed that we are often emotionally affected by people who symbolically represent aspects of our shadow that are not yet integrated. Do you feel anger towards that colleague who imposes themselves arrogantly? Perhaps they are mirroring your own inability to assert yourself. Do you feel drained by someone who lives off emotional manipulation? Perhaps you are seeing from the outside your own unconscious tendency to manipulate to be loved. The shadow does not disappear when ignored. It simply transfers to others. That is why certain people unbalance us disproportionately. It is not just about them. It is about what they activate, or rather, about what they reveal. They function as psychological mirrors. They unintentionally show what you have spent your whole life trying to hide. And that is why they exhaust you. Because dealing with them is, without realizing it, dealing with yourself. The true energy drainage is not just the wear and tear of coexistence. It is the wear and tear of internal resistance. It is fighting to keep your persona intact, that social mask you built to appear good, fair, strong, altruistic, while the shadow insists on appearing on the screen of your relationships. The more you try to maintain the idealized image of yourself, the more energy you spend suppressing what inevitably returns. This process is unconscious, but it has very real effects: chronic anxiety, irritability, diffuse guilt, a sense of emptiness, exhaustion without apparent cause. And the most tragic part? You continue to believe that the problem is others, that you are too nice, too sensitive, too generous, when in fact you are just too divided. Jung taught that the path to freedom begins when we have the courage to withdraw projections and confront the shadow face to face. When we stop fighting against the image that the other awakens in us and start asking, what does this say about me? But this journey is not easy. Integrating the shadow is hard work. It requires abandoning the comfort of victimhood, facing inconvenient truths, and taking responsibility for oneself. And this leads us to an even more challenging idea. True energetic protection is not a shield. It is a process of internal transformation. In the next part, we will dive into the Jungian concept of Opus contra naturam, the work against the automatic nature of the psyche. A process that requires conscious effort, but which, according to Jung, is the only real way to become invulnerable to emotional manipulation and psychic contamination. If what you're hearing resonates with you, you'll find real value in my ebooks. Beyond the Shadow breaks down Jung's core ideas, while Dialogues with the Unconscious gives you a 30-day path to apply them in your life. Both are linked in the pinned comment. Most people seek easy solutions for their emotional suffering. When they feel drained, overwhelmed, or invaded, they look for answers in external techniques: meditation, crystals, herbal baths, mantras, white light visualizations. While these rituals may provide temporary relief, Jung believed that none of them touch the root of the problem. For him, true psychic protection is not ritualistic, symbolic, or mystical. It is transformational. Jung called this process Opus, contra naturam, the work against nature, a direct reference to the spiritual alchemy he saw as a metaphor for individuation. It is a conscious effort to break free from emotional automatism, integrate what is in the shadow, and develop what in us remains primitive, blind, and unconscious, the inferior function. But why against nature? Because everything in us wants to stay as it is. The psyche has inertia. It prefers the known, the comfortable, the repeated. It wants to keep saving others, playing the victim, clinging to old roles, reacting as it always has. And it is precisely this that keeps the door open for energy drainage. When you operate on autopilot, your psyche becomes vulnerable, predictable, manipulable, exposed. The opus contra naturam demands the opposite, an intentional movement against old patterns. It is, for example, the type who lives in thought, forcing themselves to dive into feeling. It is the extrovert learning to tolerate the silence of introspection. It is the compulsive caregiver learning to say no without guilt. It is the individual who always gives in, starting to set boundaries, even trembling inside. It is the one who always blamed others, finally admitting, the problem is in me. This process is painful. It requires courage, because every time you challenge an automatic pattern, you touch on old traumas. You feel fear, anguish, doubt. Your mind tries to sabotage you, saying it's easier to return to the old role. But it is precisely there that alchemy happens. Each time you face a weak point and refuse to repeat the unconscious pattern, something inside you reorganizes. You begin to become whole, and the more whole you are, the less vulnerable. Jung said that no one illuminates themselves by imagining figures of light, but rather by making the darkness conscious. The true psychic shield is not made of mystical energy protection, but of lucidity. It is knowing who you are, what hurts you, what attracts you, and why. It is identifying emotional games before they settle in. It is recognizing the shadow when it manifests. It is developing the inferior function until it ceases to be an open door to contamination. By performing the opus contra naturam, you not only stop being drained, you become invisible to emotional vampires. They literally can no longer connect with you because you no longer emit the frequency of lack, guilt, or the need to please. You are no longer available to be used as an emotional crutch. Your psyche no longer offers space for the other to invade. But this state of emotional autonomy does not happen on its own. It needs to be built, cultivated, sustained by conscious actions. Therefore, in the next part, we will provide practical tips based on Jung's thinking for you to start developing this internal shielding today, one step at a time, but all of them towards psychological self-sufficiency. True energetic protection, according to Carl Jung, does not happen when we distance ourselves from people or surround ourselves with mystical techniques. It begins when we become internally whole. Being psychologically self-sufficient means, above all, stopping using others as an extension of our own emotional lack. It means ceasing to operate from the need to be loved, accepted, or useful, and instead starting to act from awareness. A large part of the people who feel constantly drained are stuck in an unconscious pattern of serving. They do this not out of genuine compassion, but because they learned at some point in childhood that they would only be loved if they were needed. They repeat this behavior like a ritual, solving other people's problems, taking on pains that are not theirs, offering a shoulder, listening, energy. But the motivation behind this is not altruism. It is psychic survival. This is the kind of pattern that needs to be broken. And breaking a pattern requires, first of all, awareness. It is necessary to clearly perceive when you are entering the automatic mode of the savior. Every time you feel the need to help someone, ask yourself, is this help really useful, or am I just trying to feel necessary? Another essential step is the development of the inferior function. As Jung pointed out, it is precisely through this less developed function that external contents penetrate. When you ignore this side of your psyche, it becomes fertile ground for emotional manipulations, induced guilt, control games. Start exercising the part of you that you have always avoided. If you are extremely rational, dive into emotional language, even if it feels uncomfortable. If you are emotionally impulsive, start cultivating critical thinking. If you live in the world of ideas, return to the body, to presence, to concrete action. By doing this, you close the psychic gaps through which your energy escapes. This lucidity also needs to be applied in reading relationships. Every time you leave a meeting with someone feeling confused, heavy, or emotionally drained, stop. Reflect. Ask yourself, what did this person really want from me? What did they activate in me that I have not yet integrated? Sometimes, it is not about the other wanting to harm you. It is about you being too available to carry what is not yours. This self-observation needs to become a constant practice. The relationships that bother us the most are often those that mirror parts of ourselves that have not yet been integrated. If someone deeply irritates you, question why. What is there in this behavior that affects you so much? What do you not want to recognize that also lives within you? The answer to these questions is the map of your shadow, and therefore, of your healing. Saying no also needs to stop being an act of guilt and become an act of self-love. You are not here to carry the world on your shoulders. You are not here to be perfect, to please everyone, to always be available. Every time you say yes when you wanted to say no, you reinforce the unconscious idea that you need to sacrifice yourself to be accepted. And this idea is the favorite food of those who drain others. Psychological self-sufficiency also requires solitude, not painful loneliness, but conscious solitude. The ability to be alone without feeling that something is missing. When you learn to nourish yourself from your own presence, something changes in the energetic field. You stop emitting the frequency of dependence, lack, and the need for approval. And with that, you stop attracting parasitic relationships. Emotional vampires are not interested in those who do not have open doors. This is the most important point. You do not need to fight against emotional vampires. Just become someone they cannot see. And this only happens when your psychic structure stops being a patchwork quilt sewn together by lack, fear, and denial. When you become whole, you become invisible to everything that once drained you. And it is exactly this idea that we will explore in the last part of this video. Because when you do this integration work, those who once drained you disappear, as if they simply can no longer perceive you. Few things are as liberating as realizing that you no longer need to defend yourself from anyone, because no one has access to who you used to be. When you integrate your wounds, confront your shadow, and develop the blind spots of your personality, something changes in a profound and irreversible way. You stop emitting the unconscious signal that attracted destructive people into your life. Carl Jung observed that the unconscious communicates through patterns. As long as you remain unaware of your complexes, such as the need to please, the compulsion to help, the fear of rejection, you emit them as frequency. And those who operate from psychic lack always find, like a magnet, those who feed off it. Not out of malice, but out of resonance. That's why inner work transforms not only you, it transforms the relationships around you. Because the bonds that were sustained by your fragility simply cease to make sense. People who once seemed indispensable begin to drift away. Some disappear. Others try to keep the game going, but no longer find in you the point of connection. And the most curious thing is that often you don't even need to confront or fight with these people. The separation happens naturally, almost as if they no longer recognize you, and in a way, they really don't. What they saw in you was your fragile persona, your need to be seen, loved, needed. When that mask falls, there is no longer a role to play. However, this change requires responsibility, because psychic self-sufficiency is lonely at first. You will realize that many of your relationships were sustained by your unconscious willingness to sacrifice yourself. You will miss being necessary. You will doubt the path, but keep going. Because what comes next is a kind of peace that no longer depends on anyone. Jung did not promise comfort. He promised awareness. And with it comes a kind of freedom that no one can take from you. You no longer need to flee from toxic people because you no longer carry within you the hooks they used to reach you. You have become whole. And when that happens, emotional vampires simply no longer see you. You have gone off their radar and finally entered your own axis. If this video touched you in any way, I want to hear from you. Leave in the comments. What part impacted you the most? At what moment in your life did you feel most drained? This space exists for exchange and reflection. And perhaps your comment will help someone who is still in the midst of the process. And if you are on this journey of psychological strengthening, don't stop here. The next video will take you even deeper. Because this path, although lonely, doesn't have to be walked in the dark. And you are not alone in this search.